Chips are what makes today's world go round, and there's a worldwide competition to make more to keep economies from collapsing.
Automotive cannot sell a car for lack of a $5 chip.
Would you say that there's been an over-reliance in terms of what was wise economically, an over-reliance on chips made in Asia?
Currently, it's like 80% is being produced in Asia.
This week, we report from Germany, one country joining the U.S. in the race to find new sources of essential technology.
The U.S. support for Ukraine, especially high-tech weapons, has helped keep Russia at bay. But that success may create a bigger problem downrange.
I signed off on these weapon systems 3 years ago. Deterrence is key, right? It's been 3 years and we haven't delivered one of these weapon systems into Taiwan.
This week, does America have a problem delivering critical aid to allies?
And we're at the Berlin Wall, revisiting its dark past and finding out why keeping a piece of its history is worthwhile.
It was here that people stood up and said, we have to keep something of this wall.
Welcome to Full Measure. I'm Sharyl Attkisson. We begin today with a deep dive into a topic you've probably heard mentioned a lot since the COVID chaos, the global computer chip shortage. It's cost American companies billions of dollars and impacted availability of countless consumer electronics from cars to smartphones. Even worse, it affects the military and medical supply chains. One thing it's hit home is how ill-advised it is to rely on an adversary, China, for something so crucial. Today, we're off to Germany and a center of global efforts to cure the world's Chinese chip addiction.
Our first stop is a workshop situated inconspicuously in the backyard of a repurposed home. At work is a small team from a cutting-edge robot programming company, Wandelbots.
And you see two colleagues of mine just working with the robot.
Jonas Schreiber is a Wandelbots executive.
So Wandelbots is a robotics technology company enabling people to work with robots incredibly easily and intuitively.
Theirs is but one growing success story in the high-tech cluster of Saxony in eastern Germany.
So we are partnering with different companies from the industrial segment, and they are also, of course, delivering to big semiconductor businesses like Intel, GlobalFoundries, and Infineon.
But do you feel there's something special going on here that's not happening in other places in the world?
Yeah, I think this area has a lot of ingenuity, also due to its historical past, so that people are really creative in solving industrial challenges.
Saxony, East Germany, was communist-controlled until 1990, after the Berlin Wall dividing East and West Germany came down. Left behind, a rich pool of highly skilled, hard-working microelectronics engineers.
This is doing
Thomas Kralinski is Saxony's state secretary for economic affairs.
We call it Silicon Saxony, and it comes actually already from the communist East German times, where we had productions and development of semiconductors here as well. This was sort of the base for everything what came like in the last 30 years.
I'm a fan of robots.
Today, the region is the heart of Europe's semiconductor or computer chip making efforts, and site of showcases like the Robotics Festival.
Can you characterize how active things are in terms of the tech industry in Saxony now?
All of the firms are thinking, or on the way of thinking, of expanding their facilities. And I think Europe is thinking more about being sovereign when it comes to producing chips. We have about 1/3 of the European production of chips here in Dresden, which is quite a lot. But on a worldwide scale, it's not too much, and it can be more.
Here in Europe and in the U.S., the goal is to reduce long-standing dependence on companies in Asia to avoid a repeat of the critical chip shortage after the COVID shutdowns. It's impacting sales of everything from cars to iPhones and Mac computers.
I would like to talk to you about the physics of semiconductors.
It's America that invented semiconductors.
I have here a small rectangular piece of a semiconductor.
Today, they're used in cars and thousands of electronics that we use every day. But the U.S. produces just 10% of the world's chips. Europe accounts for another 10%, mostly made here in Silicon Saxony. Taiwan makes 2/3 of the global supply. With current tensions between Taiwan and China, which controls the island chain, the chip-making imbalance poses national defense concerns. The U.S. CHIPS Act, passed in August, aims to address concerns with $280 billion taxpayer dollars to pump up computer chip production and high-tech research. Europe is working on its own CHIPS Act, and governments around the globe are spending billions on similar efforts. At a stop in Berlin, we spoke to Monica Lischke with top chip maker Intel.
Is this the biggest single initiative Intel's had?
Yeah.
She tells me that Intel is spending $20 billion to build a mega factory here in Germany. It's making a similar investment in Ohio, its first new manufacturing site in 40 years, and expanding sites in Ireland, Oregon, New Mexico, and Arizona.
Would you say that there has been an over-reliance in terms of what was wise economically, an over-reliance on chips made in Asia?
Well, we've seen an unbalance in global supply chain. So currently it's like 80% is being produced in Asia and 20% it's like the split between the United States and the European Union. So it's 80-20. So our long-term goal as within the industry is to kind of come to 50-50. So 50% Asia and 50% then between the United States and the European Union.
Our final stop is a drive south from Berlin to Dresden. Thank you so much. Where another company, Global Foundries, is playing a big part in the new chip drive.
Sometimes how thin these pipes are.
Executive Jens Drews shows us the company's expansive Saxony factory, Europe's biggest. It includes clean room floor space of more than 560,000 square feet. Here they make chips for electronics like the Amazon Echo, Apple Watches, and smartphones.
So you will be surprised how light it is, yeah?
Oh, it is.
During COVID, Global Foundries ramped up rather than shut down.
How it all fits together here.
And announced expansion of its Saxony site and U.S. operations.
In the United States, there's talk about over-reliance on Asian producers when it comes to computer chips.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's the case worldwide. And so in Europe and in the US, discussion began what happens if we are vulnerable because the supply chains no longer work. And I think the chip shortage was not politically inspired. It just happened because demand and supply were out of whack. But now the realization is there. We should not be completely dependent on 2 or 3 countries in pretty volatile region.
Whether it's here in Saxony or in the U.S., more companies and governments than ever are turning up the dial on production. In the end, even with the new infusion of billions of tax dollars, it'll take years to shift the global chip-making balance. But supporters say at least the switch has been flipped on.
Do you think this whole landscape is changing now in a way we haven't seen in many years?
It's on the way to correct basically neglect of this industry for many decades in the US and in Europe. And there's now a new sense of realism, a new sense of urgency. The whole healthcare relies on electronics. Car safety has made tremendous progress with the help of microchips. Our ability to communicate virtually for free, to send pictures, send messages, to stay connected with people around the globe, that is all due to microelectronics, and we haven't seen the end yet.
By the way, Silicon Valley and Silicon Saxony are so called because silicon is the material most commonly used in chips. It's considered an ideal and inexpensive semiconductor of electricity. Coming up next, what Taiwan is waiting for. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the U.S. stepped in with massive military assistance immediately. But you might be surprised to hear about other countries that have bought and paid for U.S. military weaponry and are in limbo on delivery. Scott Thuman reports.
To many, this is the sound of success. Outmatched and outmanned, Ukraine needed help in securing the right kind of weapons to repel Russian advances. And the U.S. provided, making the difference between a quick Russian victory and a fair fight now stretching into its 9th month.
That the United States is leading our allies and partners around the world to make sure the courageous Ukrainians who are fighting for the future of the nation have the weapons and the capacity and ammunition and equipment to defend themselves against Putin's brutal war.
But that's not always the case. In fact, it may be the exception to the rule.
It's the thing, in Washington, everybody knows this. And it's like a dirty little secret, right? Everybody knows it's happening, but no one really talks about it.
Congressman Mike McCall is the ranking Republican on the House Foreign Affairs Committee.
We cannot manufacture and produce weapon systems fast enough, and we have a major backlog. And there are many reasons for this, but it does pose a national security issue.
He says Washington, D.C. has been big on promises and weak on results, selling hundreds of billions worth of weapons to friendly nations, then often failing to deliver.
Good example, Taiwan. My position on Foreign Affairs Committee, I sign off on all foreign military sales. So I signed off on these weapon systems 3 years ago, dating back 3 years ago to Taiwan. You know, deterrence is key, right? It's been 3 years and we haven't delivered one of these weapon systems into Taiwan. So when I see the ambassador from Taiwan, and they're very worried about the current threat from Chinese Communist Party invading, particularly after what Putin did in Ukraine and their alliance, I have to tell her that we can't deliver. And you know, that comes at a price. And it hurts our diplomacy efforts, but it hurts our deterrence against these major foreign nation adversaries like Russia, China, Iran, North Korea.
Earlier this year, the online publication Defense News published a list of backlogged weapons deliveries, including Taiwan's $8 billion purchase of 66 F-16 fighter jets, as well as $620 million in replacement parts for its Patriot missile system.
What does that feel like when they're saying, we signed papers 3 years ago for these weapons, where are they?
You feel you got one hand tied behind your back, you know? You feel sort of impotent in a way because you can't deliver on sales that you promised them. Remember, in Taiwan, they actually had purchased these weapons. It's not like we're giving them. They have purchased these weapons, and the backlog goes back 3 years. I participated in a tabletop exercise with the Pentagon in a classified space, not to get into details, but the fact is, if we can't provide them the weapons necessary to deter Chairman Xi from invading, it makes the chances of him doing that more likely.
McCall has written a bill that would force the government to detail how many deals to how many countries are unfulfilled. Sometimes because ramping up production of weapons takes time and supply chain issues don't help.
You questioned Secretary of State's Antony Blinken about this.
Maybe it'd be helpful if we got state and DOD and the contractors in the same room together to find out how can we fix this broken system.
First, just quickly on Taiwan, I welcome working with you and other members on this to make sure that we can streamline the timelines. Yep. To make sure that they are getting what they need to defend themselves.
Were you happy with the response you got?
Not really. he almost deferred to the Department of Defense, like that's not really my issue. But it is. Because if we can't get these weapon systems into our allies, into places like Taiwan, into the eastern flank of NATO, it is a State Department failure. It's a failure in diplomacy.
Creating, he worries, an even deeper concern that if friendly nations can't wait for U.S. hardware, they could turn to other countries, forging new relations with America's competition.
So do we, meaning the U.S., have the weapons that we need?
Well, that's the big question. The U.S. government has put in a large order for new weapons in the last few months. We're talking about $352 million in Javelin missiles, another $624 million worth of Stinger missiles. In September, Congress appropriated, gave $1.5 billion to help replenish the stockpile. Keep in mind, $15 billion worth of weapons went to Ukraine. So you got to make up that ground. But analysts say it could take years to rebuild the inventories.
Interesting. Good report. Thanks, Scott. When we come back, the fall of one of the world's most infamous walls. "33 years ago this week saw the official fall of Germany's Berlin Wall. The infamous barrier grew to represent the Cold War, a tense rivalry between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. Today, we're on the scene in Berlin for an historic look at the iconic symbol.
This is the real wall, so to speak. But
Axel Klausmeier is today's tour guide, showing us where remnants of the Berlin Wall remain.
When the wall came down in '89, it was here that people stood up and said, we have to keep something of this wall because so much happened here.
At the end of World War II, defeated Germany and the capital of Berlin were divided among the winners, the U.S., the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and France.
So we have the eastern part of the city in the Soviet bloc, and we have the three Western allies in the western sectors.
Construction of the 96-mile-long wall in Berlin began quietly in 1961. East Germany claimed it was an anti-fascist bulwark to keep out what they called right-wing fascists of the Free West.
So the real reason for the wall going up in August 1961 was simply that a great number of people were fleeing East Germany, communist East Germany. So the last answer to this movement of people escaping is that the communist regime has rebuilt a wall. So we keep people in so that they cannot get out anymore. And this is all taking place here in this very street. And we have an icon of the Cold War. This is the defecting soldier Konrad Schumann, again in this very street. On August 15th, 1961, he's jumping over the barbed wire in front of Western cameras in the middle of the Cold War.
Berlin's wall stood for 2 decades, impervious to challenge, until a new thinking politician took over as Soviet leader.
In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev became the highest sort of communist leader in the Soviet Union, and with him, changes started.
Gorbachev pursued policies of greater openness, freedoms of speech and press, and democratization. He conferred with President Reagan on ways to end the Cold War.
Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate.
In 1987, in West Berlin, President Reagan made his famous call for the Berlin Wall to come down.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
The border officially crumbled on November 9, 1989, after demonstrators asked an East German official when the boundary was going to loosen.
He said, oh, well, I don't know. Well, I think, to my opinion, it's right now, immediately. So everyone rushed to the border checkpoints and were producing so much force, really, so that the border guards, who were not informed about that, stood there and simply let people go. And that was the end, because the wall and itself was the sort of the basis for the existence of the East German state. And as soon as the wall was down, the state was gone. We go to this memorial over there in the center. We know of at least 140 people that died at the Berlin Wall between 61 and 89. And you can see it, the majority is young and male. Peter Fechter, he just wanted to have a better life and tried to escape, was shot down from the wall. He was wounded and he was bleeding to death in front of the cameras.
18 years old.
Yeah, 18 years old. This is Günther Litwin. He was the first person shot at the wall in 24th of August, 61. You can see some children here. Cengaver Katranci, a young Turkish boy. Giuseppe Savoca, an Italian boy, and Çetin Mert, a young Turkish boy. They were all brought up in the West. No intention to escape. They all fell into the river. The river was already Eastern territory, and as soon as you would have entered the river to rescue these poor creatures, you would have committed a border violence, as it was interpreted. And then the border guards would have had the right to shoot. That's why they all drowned to death. No one dared to rescue these poor children. And that is their stories.
The Berlin Wall was patrolled by at least 12,000 border guards at any given time, or about 120 guards for every mile of wall. After a break, what's ahead next week on Full Measure? An update to our reporting on the Trump-era rule requiring, for the first time, that hospitals post price lists. An Atlanta-based hospital group is the first to be fined under the law. Northside Hospital System was hit with more than $1 million in penalties, according to federal officials. They say Northside failed to post a prominent, searchable, consumer-friendly list of standard charges. Coming up next week on Full Measure, we're on the trail of one of the biggest Medicare schemes surrounding COVID to date, and a fraudster who bilked taxpayers out of millions.
In 2018, he had only billed about $2.8 million. In 2019, it had gone up to about $9.8 million. And in 2020, it was, again, $90 million billed.
We follow the money next week on Full Measure. Until then, we'll be searching for more stories that hold powers accountable.